Hello, friends, and welcome to the CUInsight Network. My name is Randy Smith. I'm one of the co-founders of CUInsight.com and also the host of the CUInsight Experience podcast. And it's my job on this show to have conversations with the thought leaders who support the credit union community, to identify some issues that are affecting all of us in credit unions and have a discussion around those best practices that maybe we can gain a few nuggets from and learn and improve our credit unions overall. I was really excited today. My guest on the show today is Cameron Madill. He is the CEO and co-owner of PixelSpoke. So let's just jump right into this conversation. Cameron, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks for having me, Randy. I'm looking forward to it.
I like to start, and this was something I realized on the other podcast. Most of us didn't grow up wanting to be in credit unions when we were kids. So a couple of questions for you. What did you want to be when you were growing up? And how did you find your way to credit unions and being the co-owner and CEO of PixelSpoke?
Yeah, great question. Growing up, I had no idea what a credit union was, nor that anyone owned businesses. So I had three things I was really passionate about before I became like a really sullen middle schooler. And I loved writing. I loved writing stories. I loved math, and I loved basketball. So any
Okay.
one of those, a professional writer, an NBA basketball player, or a mathematician all seemed super fun to me because I could just get into this state of flow like nothing else.
Oh, that's awesome. Huh. So did you play basketball, I take it, growing up as well? And my
I
other
did, yeah.
question is, do you still write? So,
Yeah, I still love writing. I write as much as I can. I use it as a kind of just a vehicle to express myself, but mostly we've obviously written a lot for CUInsight, which we love
absolutely.
doing.
Yeah.
We converted to a worker-owned cooperative, and we've done a lot of work in kind of the values-driven business space. And I use all those as kind of opportunities to just share what's inside my head.
You're adding more questions already that I can't wait to dig into more. So, but first, for everybody listening, if let's just you and we meet at a conference, maybe one of those in-person things happens again. Give us the quick elevator pitch. What is PixelSpoke, and where do you add value to the credit union system?
Yeah, I mean the whole core of what we love doing is building the website as the hub of a credit union's digital branch. And so that includes, making sure that the website is beautiful, that it really looks differentiated, that it's really captured the essence and the flavor of that particular credit union, that it has a great user experience and smooth technology integrations. And then I think the last thing, which everyone is talking about and is just so important, is that there's a real focus on tracking. And we really think that needs to go end to end, all the way down to was a loan funded, but the member didn't accept it, and so on and so forth, versus just the activities that happen on the website.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. We have all this data, right? So now it's what do we do with it? So it's yeah, when we were preparing for the show, there were a few different things that I was thinking about. That idea of kind of transforming the credit union business model. I think when you're talking about you just were talking about kind of building that beautiful, functional, trackable site. We saw over the past year or so you got to have the digital presence, right? Like it's just we're not going to put that genie back in the bottle, obviously. And I would honestly say we weren't even before COVID. But what does that mean? Delivering to members that kind of inclusive website where they have that user experience and the design, and then for the credit union, the ROI side as well.
Yeah, I love that question, Randy. So I guess I heard a couple different components.
Yeah.
One, I think, is how do credit unions differentiate? And I think a lot of it comes down to some of the really basic principles of strategy of where can credit unions go that their competitors won't. I always think that's like such a simple but useful framing. And I think credit unions as member-owned cooperatives are able and willing to do things that other financial institutions aren't. So one of the things that we like to talk about is what we call the 3 C's of cause marketing, which is really how to differentiate as an impact-driven institution. So the first C is having a core focus, something that's just so simple and easy to understand, that it's not fuzzy, it's not squishy, but as a member or prospective member, I'm like, I get it. I want to be part of that. The non-credit union example I always love is Tom's Shoes, which was such a phenomenally successful business. And as a consumer, you just had to say, hey, I buy a pair of shoes and some child in the developing world gets a free pair of shoes. I get a cool pair of shoes, they get a free pair of shoes. It's so simple. And another great example in the credit union space of this is a startup credit union from the last roughly 5 years called Clean Energy Credit Union. And so as a consumer, if I care about climate change and I care about the environment, I know that every deposit I make at this credit union is going to get used to fund green loans, so solar panels or business improvements or electric vehicles. So that's the first C, is core focus. The second one is a commitment to transparency, and it's something that credit unions actually do super well because they're regulated institutions, but we don't necessarily have that DNA around the impact that we're having. So there's really powerful standards like the Global Alliance for Banking on Values, the B Corp movement, which is something that PixelSpoke is part of. And they're kind of, you can think of them as, it's not a good way to sell this, but it's like NCUA regulations, but for impact. So that commitment to transparency, which includes a degree of humility, that we all are on a journey to have a positive impact in the world and we all have a long way to go. But by putting that out there, it creates a lot of trust. And then the third C is, of course, communicating memorably. And at the end of the day, if we can't do something that is memorable, we actually called our podcast the Remarkable Credit Union podcast, because we think being remarkable is truly the goal of marketing, right? Is it something that is worth remarking on, that's going to sort of spread of its own accord because it's so thought-provoking or interesting that word of mouth will naturally take off. So that's kind of my thought of like those three C's of core focus, commitment to transparency, and communicating memorably for how credit union can go where its competitors won't go.
Well, first of all, we will link to the podcast in the show notes. Everybody should listen to it. It's fantastic. I've listened, and I will. That's it's so. Gosh, what you said there. There's a lot to unpack. Hey, let me ask you this from this may be a scratch my own itch question more than anything else, but I mean, credit unions are cooperative, financial institutions. You've talked about, your business making an impact as well, and now being cooperatively owned. How did you make that decision, I guess, to do that as well?
Yeah, great question, Randy. It's I mean, the honest answer is, this is not, buttering you and our audience up, is it was working with credit unions that opened our eyes to there being a different structure in capitalism. And so I always found it very intriguing. And we've seen clients who have everything from a few dozen people at an annual meeting to thousands. So there's a whole range of how people engage their membership in that cooperative model, but it really intrigued me. And then, as I mentioned, through the B Corp community, which we're part of, so
Yeah.
certified B corporations are companies that publicly measure their environmental, community, workplace, and ownership impact. So all these different stakeholders they're looking at. We started meeting other worker-owned cooperatives, and I guess, to be honest, as I looked at, I don't know if I look at, I'm 40, I'm 41, I'm almost 42, Randy. So, who
Yeah,
knows
yeah.
how long I've got. But I've met a lot of business owners who kind of seem stuck in their businesses. Like they just don't really know, they don't really want to be there, but they don't know how to get out. And I often would see people kind of feel trapped, honestly. And so they would often kind of just sell their business to a large marketing, 1,000-person marketing agency that sort of has holding companies all around the world, or maybe to a technology company that will just turn this marketing company into like an add-on, a throw in to their big contracts. And so I think a lot about sustainability and how, I didn't want to be the sole owner of PixelSpoke forever. I don't think that's healthy. I want to share ownership. I want to build leaders. I want to create something that I hope I can still make a contribution, but it's not really about me.
Yeah.
And so the model just, we're almost a year and a half into it, Randy, and it's been a wild ride. It's certainly not been without challenges, but it just feels like the kind of thing that I'm fired up to wake up in the morning and say, like, how can we build a business that shares ownership and is based on the concepts of democratic control?
Oh, that's beautiful. And my guess is the credit union folks are going to be interested to hear this, but I can pick your brain even more down after we're done. So, or else this could go a long time. That's awesome. I did not know any of that, so I'm like sitting here going, "There's so many more questions." But that, to kind of get back to credit unions overall, in the, a couple of questions that I also had for you was, for credit unions, what's that kind of most important first step to take when it comes to their website development, right? Like getting down to the, I guess, the nuts of it there, where they can achieve that positive impact in their members' lives. And then to add on to that, you mentioned it very early on about measuring results, or measuring what happens, the whole way through. How do you connect those two and measure the results all the way through?
Yeah, great question. So, there's a lot of steps, but one of the places I would start was some articles we wrote for a fine publication, CUInsight, on digital social responsibility.
We'll link to those too. So
You'll link to those, I'm sure. Which was really fun. It's a really cool concept that I believe came out of MIT originally, and it's thinking about what does positive impact look like in the digital space, because it's a gigantic thing, right? The carbon emissions from the internet, from server farms, would be like, I think, like the third biggest country in the world or something like that. So how do we think about our digital presence as something we need to optimize? We need to have be a thriving core part of our strategy, and also do it in a way that's responsible, that's consonant with the cooperative values and principles. So the first step, I would say, it's always the first step, I believe, is just doing some kind of user testing. And in particular, I would say, as a credit union, thinking about who your members are and looking for something that's often ignored. So there's this concept of stress cases or edge cases where you say, I'm going to design my product for kind of the median user. I might be that person in America, right? 41 years old, white, upper middle class, pretty comfortable with technology. But instead you say, what are sort of the folks at the edges? And rather than saying, we don't care about those folks, that's the edge of the bell curve, we say, if we try to build a really great user experience for them and make it easy and delightful and intuitive for them, that actually that's the best way to build the best kind of product. So that could be someone with different physical abilities. That could be someone with a different racial or ethnic background, someone who's not a native English speaker. It could be someone who's very old or very young. And I just a brief story, because this all to me is most clearly told through this concept from OXO, which is this maker of kitchenware that many of you know probably. Right. And it's so, I love it. We've got it all over my kitchen because it's just so easy to use. And I never worry about like slipping and cutting myself or whatever. And I heard this like over a decade ago, and it was one of their heads of user experience. And he said, we never design for the average user, we design for the extremes. So if we can build a kitchen knife that works for a 90-year-old, let's say a 90-year-old woman who has arthritis and limited mobility, or a 7-year-old child, then, and it's a great experience for them, we're going to just delight everyone else. So I think that's literally the first place, is to watch people using your technology, and not like your internal users, but right. real potential users. And that just tends to surface an enormous set of really easy, low-hanging fruit to improve your website.
That makes a ton of sense. And then how do you, like, how are you tracking this going all the way through from, like that user experience, but then also once live to say, are we getting the results that we want?
Yeah, thank you. I forgot to answer that question. So I think of it as like the default way that websites are set up is kind of like if we were running a grocery store and we had video cameras on everything in the grocery store except for the checkout line. So it'd be like, right. Wow, Randy picked up, I don't know your choices, but Randy picked up 3 bags of Doritos and some Twinkies. I know Twinkies are gone. It breaks my heart. And some apples, right? And we're like, that's so interesting. But we don't know, did you put that all down? Or did you actually finish the checkout? Did you grab some, additional things, cough drops when you actually, got into line? So the core thing is there's a lot of focus on figuring out, attributing properly to who got to the website, how, why, what do they do on the website? So that's another funnel of the people who say get to a checking account page or a Visa page, how many actually go through and click the button? Then it gets a little harder which can really depend on the third-party vendors, but saying, can we actually get tracking set up on their online application forms? And then the last thing is, which is the kind of the holy grail for all of us, is how do we close the loop and say, how many of these loans or accounts actually went all the way through the process and were funded, or were they rejected by the credit union because they didn't have good enough qualifications for underwriting, or were they accepted but we were too slow and they got the loan elsewhere? So I don't have a silver bullet, but I think the I think the core thing as a credit union is to be aware that that is the goal. And we, of course, want to focus optimizing our digital marketing, advertising, getting to the website. We want to focus our website's conversion rate, but understanding that we're trying to look at that complete picture and we're not just looking at one particular piece, because it's really possible to optimize one piece of the funnel and actually create worse overall outcomes. I've seen that where one example from also like over a decade ago was when we worked with a broader range of clients. We had a partner who drove traffic to a website because they saw that the clicks on the button went up when they drove traffic for this one search term. And so they shifted all this traffic from kind of a very focused search term to a more general one. But the problem is the more general term were like the bargain shoppers. And so they got more clicks on the buttons, but their close rate, literally when they measured it internally, their close rate dropped to like 10% of what it had been. So it was enormously expensive and painful for that client because this one vendor was only looking at one piece of the puzzle. And that'll always be part of the reality. But I think as you know, marketers and executives at credit unions always saying, what's the whole funnel and how can we make sure we're connecting the dots?
That's a great story, that's for sure. To wrap up the first part of the show, and I'm so excited to ask you this, but the idea of, you know, pre-pandemic, it's going on now. We've seen a ton of disruption and innovation coming to financial services across the board, inside, outside of credit unions. I'm sure there's just, I don't think any of us believe that that's going to slow down or stop, right? So what trends are you seeing, and where, like, where's PixelSpoke's focus, as we go forward to help credit unions meet these challenges?
Yeah, great question. So I mean, we've thought about this a lot, and we have literally, three pillars to our strategy. The first one, and I think this just maps to what we believe credit unions should be doing in the digital space. It's not complicated. So the first one is a mixture of best practices and creativity. So making sure that we're not reinventing the wheel, but we're also really focused on things like real photos of real people from our field of membership and our geographic area, so that we don't just look like a generic national bank. The second pillar is the digital branch, which we already talked about, of saying how do we get holistic measurement of what people are doing from end to end and not just for one piece. And then the third one is really telling social impact stories. And so I think storytelling is something that kind of gets talked about all the time at conferences and marketing. But I really look at what people are doing to sort of make that like an integral part of their credit union. So I love, we talked a bit about this, Randy, in the pre-show, if I can call it the pre-show. I don't know, whatever it
Absolutely,
was
sure.
when we talked, all right, whatever it was that we did. I think about, a credit union that I really admire is called Peninsula Credit Union in Washington State. And
It's
they have
Jim Morrell's shop, right?
Jim Morrell, yeah. And
Yeah.
he's had every person is a certified financial coach, including like the IT staff and back office people. And so I think the storytelling kind of happens naturally when people are deeply connected to the heart and soul of the credit union movement. There's another one that we talked briefly about, this concept of people's trust in Houston, Texas. And they have everyone on their leadership team has to be a credit union development educator. And so I think the more that the people inside of credit unions kind of like live and feel the values and the principles, the more naturally that the stories happen. And I think that is literally credit union superpower. That is the place that a for-profit bank or a mega bank, cannot go and will not go. And we're going through a lot of this at my company with converting to a worker cooperative. It's very different than the average person, the average employee's understanding and expectation of what business is. But if we can create that alignment and connection around these sort of deeper values and principles, then I really believe that members, in our case clients, that people can just feel the difference, and that storytelling comes through with a natural way and with a degree of authenticity that cannot be copied. So that's what I get most excited about. I get excited about a lot of things, but that's what I'm most excited about.
I love it. We will also link to the DE program, to our friends Gigi and Chad over at the foundation, because both you and I are proud DEs. We were talking about that before we did hit record. So, yeah, and Jim, I love Jim. We were in Kenya together for an international DE trip, and
Very cool.
Yeah, we did a safari and shared a van, so it was awesome. Great guy. To wrap up the show, I like to have a little bit of fun with some rapid fire questions, like we do on the other podcast. It just wouldn't be a CUInsight Network without him. So, is there a recent purchase that you made? I kind of called it the COVID purchase. Did you get the Peloton or the puppy over the past year, or was there something else that you didn't know you needed, but now you're like, I can't live without
Well, I don't think I bought it, but we had a baby in May of 2020. So, I mean, we did pay a lot of money, I guess, but
Right. See,
uh,
much more to
he
come.
has been he has been the ultimate kind of COVID just source of joy and connection, and everything seemed to be going so slowly, but every day we saw this little human grow. But on a more maybe humorous note, heck yeah, I bought a Roomba robot vacuum cleaners. I'm all in. I'm all in. That was life changing. I never even knew I needed it, but
We have two, one for upstairs and one for downstairs. So, especially when you have when we had a dog, it was a lifesaver, right? Just run that thing. So, when you hear the word success, who is the first person that comes to mind and why?
boy, that's a good question. You sent these along, but I tried not to spoil my answers. I want to sound really awkward on them. Who do I think of when I think of success? I'm going to go with a guy named Blake Jones,
Okay.
who is one of the, you may know him. He's one of the co-founders of Clean Energy Credit Union. He's a co-founder of one of the largest solar companies that's a worker-owned cooperative in the U.S. He's been a really generous kind of advisor to us in our journey, and I think he's the kind of person who's had a lot of options and paths in life, and he has just really generously dedicated himself to helping people to create more equitable models of capitalism. And he's one of those folks who I think he's at a point in life where he could really just kind of mail it in and relax. And he just seems to have more drive and commitment to give back every time I meet him. So it's a real admiration for maybe how we can stay really engaged and committed throughout life in different phases and stages.
I actually don't know him. I sounds fascinating. I love your answer. The random question: what's the greatest album of all time?
Well, so I sort of mentioned this. I didn't really get to it, I guess, in my background. So I was a jazz musician for several years, and I was really took a couple years and tried to make it, professionally. Did not. Spoiler alert, but I had fun. So I would say that yeah, I think the obvious one. There's so many, but there's a Miles Davis album called "Kind of Blue," which is one of the most, if not the most famous jazz albums of all time. But it's
Yep.
kind of like the Avengers or something. Like the talent, every single person on that album is a world class, generational talent who led bands in their own right. Including folks like John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley and Bill Evans. But the backstory is amazing that none of them had seen the music before they recorded the album. So Miles Davis just brought in these very short, and they're very simple pieces, but somehow that it just is like the essence of like people who can just channel creativity on a level that I certainly can't. And so all these master musicians sat down, never having seen it, in these incredibly simple songs, and just created this kind of sublime, transcendent album that really I think has never been equaled.
That's awesome. What'd you play?
I'm a guitarist.
You're a guitarist. Awesome. That's very cool. Is there a book that either you've gifted folks over your life, or that that book that you think everybody should read?
Hmm. Well, I think there's a book called The Seven Principles of, what is it called? I should know this. Seven Principles of like healthy marriage. I forget the exact title, from John Gottman.
Okay.
And he's a Seattle researcher, and I just think he knows more about marriage. He was sort of famous for, they would observe couples in their sort of love laboratory, they called it. They just come and move in for a weekend. They'd strap heart monitors on them. They do all this crazy stuff, and so they got to really see what was really happening. Like
Right.
if someone says something to someone else and their heart rate spikes, you can't necessarily observe that. So he really dug into like, what is it that creates like a really amazing relationship. And I think while it's aimed at marriage, I think the principles apply to every relationship. I'm terrible at rapid fire, aren't I? I'm gonna stop. I'm just gonna
Hey, no,
rapid fire. Let's do this. All right.
I love it.
All
I
right.
absolutely love it. So the calendar's empty. You mentioned you have a young son. What do you do to unwind? What's that work-life integration look like to you?
Yeah, I've always loved reading. I used to play a ton of soccer, but not so much in the pandemic. So I've got a hoop out front. I love to go shoot hoops. And then my sister and her husband live next door. We own a duplex together. So
Awesome.
sometimes it's kind of like a sitcom. I'll just like go over there and knock on the door because I'm bored. So
Right.
any of those three.
That had to be nice for the pod during the pandemic last year, right? Like we weren't seeing it many people. So
We felt good about our choices. There's no question. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, we'll link to everything that we talked about today in the show notes. I really appreciate you being here today. The last question I have of you or for you is, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share or asks of our listeners today?
Um, I think just thinking about I have talked about this in other spaces of how as a credit union can we measure our positive impact, and how can we elevate that to the point where not just the exec team but the boards can see it. So there's kind of a set of metrics that are balanced out with return on assets and all the things that the regulators have credit unions looking at, which are critical for the financial health of the cooperative, but they don't actually show how well the credit union may or may not be living up to its purpose. And so I think, the key piece of that is how do we have metrics that measure that in addition to the financial metrics? And then really thinking about what are products, Jim Morrell at Peninsula is great at this, what are products that we can add that kind of create impact in their own right? And so those are things like, products where if a member, has bad credit, but they make 6 or 12 months of repayments, you actually automatically lower their interest rate. Or you may have heard of, I'm sure that the kind of like save to win type products where it's using kind of this lottery mentality, but saying every time I save $25, I get like a lottery ticket. And so instead of buying lottery tickets, I'm building my nest egg and hey, maybe I win a free iPad out of it too. So just how can we design our products to create impact versus just writing checks and giving volunteer hours? That's two thoughts, but I like them both.
I love it. And I love the idea of measuring impact. You mentioned it earlier in the show. That's not something we often do, is measure the actual impact that we're having when we're measuring everything else nowadays. So, well, thank you again, my friend Cameron. This has been a blast. And thank you for being on the show. I hope you're well and stay healthy, my friend.
Thanks a bunch for having me. It was a real pleasure.